Hello, Chip. Thank you for being here with us. You're actually in Boston, near Boston. I'm in Oxford. I'm a Turkish yoga teacher, and you are an American independent scholar of Indian Buddhism as well as yoga. You founded the Arlington Center, where you teach physical posture practice as well as meditation. You're a faculty member at Lesley University, where you sometimes teach a course related to Buddhism. And you translated the Patanjali Sutras and made a commentary on them, which have now been translated into Turkish. So we're very happy about that through Pingala Yayın Evi. I know that you went to university quite late in age. So you studied at Boston University in your 30s, and you studied physiotherapy and philosophy, but you had started yoga way before then, and you even when you were 16, you were inspired by the Beatles and started TM meditation.
Yes.
Can you please tell us a little bit about what experiences in your early life brought you to this path?
It's a good question, because when I look back at it, I realize I had an interest in yoga even before I admired the Beatles and took the first American courses in transcendental meditation. Even earlier, I had had the chance to hear the great Indian musician Ravi Shankar play live. And also when I was at summer camp, I read a book about yoga called Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation by Jess Stern, and it interested me. But when I was in high school and took the TM course, I had a brief experience of deep concentration that clarified, that opened my eyes. And even though as a teenager I stopped meditating, just a few years later I began practicing yoga again while I was working as a musician, and got deep into it. Without intending to become a teacher, I nonetheless managed to study with some of the great Indian and Western teachers of yoga, particularly beginning in the Iyengar Krishnamacharya lineage. I studied with Krishnamacharya's son Desikachar and others, and also began to sit in meditation. And the only place I could find to do that in a kind of unfettered environment of silence and deep, continuous practice was in insight meditation retreats.
Buddhist.
Buddhist, that's right, Buddhist meditation retreats. But without a lot of Buddhist ideology, the retreats are dedicated to silence. In fact, one practices silence and continuous mindfulness practice, whether you're sitting in meditation or maybe doing a little yoga or eating and drinking or walking. All activities are imbued with mindfulness. And so concentration or samadhi can really develop under those conditions. And that's how I began to tie my experiences to the Yoga Sutra, which I had also studied with Desikachar.
So you had these experiences, and when you read the sutra that Desikachar had translated in his book Heart of Yoga, you resonated with them. But still, I mean, what made you want to learn Sanskrit and Pali and undertake this big translation? I just want to read a quote from Stephen Cope. He is the founder of Kripalu Center, and he says about...
Well, he's a teacher there. He's a teacher. He didn't found it.
Oh, really? Okay.
No, but he's an important guiding teacher at Kripalu.
Okay, I thought he was one of the founders. But he says about your book, Chip has given us a fresh, authoritative, and brilliant new translation and commentary on the sutra. His work successfully combines intellectual precision with emotional accessibility, a powerful marriage seldom even attempted with this notoriously difficult text.
Yes.
So it is, he says, notoriously difficult text.
Yes.
I looked it up. It's been translated in English maybe a dozen times in this last century.
More than that. More than that.
You want to do another translation?
So, you know what's interesting about it? It was the difficulty of the text that inspired me. The difficulty has resulted in almost every English version of the Yoga Sutra being contradictory to other versions. So, for example, when I first studied the Yoga Sutra with Desikachar, I realized that what he was teaching and how he and his father, Krishnamacharya, interpreted it was different than the other versions I'd already encountered. The very first version of it that I encountered was by the British author Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavananda. And that was from a Vedanta point of view, and it was very different. I also read translations by a couple of others. And incidentally, now there are dozens and dozens of English translations. When I was writing mine, there were about 20 that I had found, and I actually read them all. And what was so interesting to me was that each one seemed to understand one part of it in a marvelous way, but also have flaws or areas that they didn't understand. For example, Swami Satchidananda's version of it has a wonderfully humanistic understanding of the yamas and the niyamas. But when it comes to the final portions of the Yoga Sutra, and particularly the discussion of the extraordinary powers that supposedly come with deep concentration, he throws up his hands and says, I don't know what this is all about. I can't even talk about it. So in that way, I discovered that even my teacher, Desikachar, and his father had areas in their translation that didn't match up to others that sounded more authoritative. And by that time, I was already familiar with many, many technical words in Sanskrit and also in the vernacular language of Pali, in which the complete canon of the early Buddhist texts is recorded. Not all of that Pali canon is early or original, but large portions of it concord with other versions we've gotten, fragments in other traditions. And so I already knew a lot of technical terms, but the troubles in it is that these technical terms, like samadhi, for example, have no meaning at all, or a wrong meaning for people who haven't begun to experience what they're about. When you start to have experiences of yogic concentration and single-pointedness or one-pointedness, then the idea of one-pointedness makes sense. But until then, it's a little bit like being thirsty and seeing a picture of water. It can't really quench your thirst, but it can point you toward what you want.
So
and that's how the teachings are generally.
Yeah. Wrote it for practitioners.
Absolutely. It's quite clear that Patanjali, whoever Patanjali was, and I'll talk about that just for a moment, was interested in collecting some of the most profound and also technical understandings about yoga that existed in his time. Now, what was that time? Well, the grammarian Patanjali, after whom the author is named, lived around the 2nd to 3rd century before the Common Era, so just 150 to 200 years after the Buddha. And the teachings of that original bundle seem to be very close, technically, in terms of technique, of method, the actual practice, very close to what the Buddha was teaching, although the philosophical foundation of it in Sankhya is quite different. Then you have later developments in the yoga world, particularly in the Brahmanical traditions that we call Hinduism today, such as the Bhagavad Gita, where now devotion to a deity, such as Vishnu, in the case of the Gita, is very powerful and is become a kind of Well, it's come to the front of the line as practices, devotion to God. And so that's not really present in the Yoga Sutra. Now,
Or
this
in
isn't
Buddhism.
Yeah.
Or
Yes, that's right. Or in the earlier teachings of Buddhism, and even before that, in the teachings of Sankhya, on which Buddhism was based a little bit at first, although the Buddha then kind of went in a different direction. And the Yoga Sutra is based on Sankhya. The Yoga Sutra we have today, though, is much later. And today we actually call it the treatise on Patanjali Yoga, Patanjali Yoga Shastra. The reason why is because some author or editor who called himself Vyasa, another famous name in Indian lore, put together the original bundle with new teachings that clearly came after later developments in Buddhism, and put them together with a commentary, but only said, I'm the author of the commentary. Patanjali is the author of these 195 or 6 lines. You see? So scholars have been looking at this for some time, but their view has changed recently about what the Yoga Sutra really is. And today, the Yoga Sutra that we have actually has later parts of it that seem to be commenting on later developments in Buddhism.
And what you wanted to bring into your translation was the common ground it has with Buddha's teachings. Because when you did this translation in, I think, 2003, you said there weren't many people seeing a common ground between yoga and Buddhism. It was mostly a Hindu practice. And now it's become a bit more popular to align it with the Buddha's teachings.
There's been a lot more research since that time. It was published in 2003. I wrote it around 2001.
Okay.
So 20 years ago, the common ground between the Buddha's early teachings, the actual teachings of the Buddha himself, say the early Buddhist texts, as opposed to later forms of Buddhism such as Mahayana, Zen, and Vajrayana. Those were very close, as I say, in technique to the Yoga Sutra. And the Yoga Sutra has a great deal of common language with the Buddhist teachings. In some cases, it has verbatim quotes, only in Sanskrit rather than in the vernacular language of Pali. But in the Buddhist versions in Sanskrit, those match up to the Yoga Sutra.
Can you give an example of a verbatim?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure, I can give 2 examples. One example is when Patanjali is saying that to overcome distraction, when the mind is pulled this way or that way, one of the ways to bring the mind into focus is to practice loving kindness, or maitri, in Pali, metta, to practice compassion, or karuna, to practice joy in the happiness and welfare of others, sympathetic joy called mudita, and to practice upekkha, or equanimity. Equanimity. These 4 in Buddhism are called the heavenly abodes, and they may actually have originated before the Buddha, but they're a part of the Buddhist teachings. And the way that Patanjali talks about them is the same and in the same order. Likewise, when Patanjali is talking about how the yogi can develop to realize the fundamental freedom of awareness, the yogi cultivates the following 5 powers, and they are faith, mindfulness, energy, concentration, and wisdom. In Sanskrit, Shraddha, Smriti, Virya, Samadhi, and Prajna. And those 5, in that order, are also taught by the Buddha, in that order, using the same words. And as I understand it, no other teacher had listed those 5 in that order before Gautama, the Buddha. So Patanjali is clearly borrowing it. There's a later passage, too, that's even more to the point, where Patanjali is talking about how, as we're awakening, we're beginning to see how things arise and pass away. How what seems like just the reality right now, sitting here in this room, it's just here we are and this is reality, is an illusion. And that when clarity of vision arises, we can see that it's one moment of consciousness after another, arising and passing away. And his discussion of that is identical to the Buddha's description of arising and passing away, using the same words and describing its importance in the same way. In fact, in the famous Buddhist teaching called the Dhammapada, the Buddha, or whoever wrote the Dhammapada, says, it's better to have a life that only lasts for one day, but to realize arising and passing away, than to live a life of 100 years and never realize it. Because when we see arising and passing away, we're actually seeing that awareness is free, and that everything we think is ourself and the world are all comprised of conditions arising one after another. And their drama, their pain, the grasping, the hatred, or the pushing away, all of these are not actually who you or I
and
am.
when we realize our true identity, then suffering ceases. And is there then an experience of joy? I'm a bit confused about Patanjali talking about any attachment to any great experience is still not the final realization. Does he say that? That's how I remember reading in the last chapter, I think, the last part, that if there is a joy or an experience in the body, are we still not there yet? Are we still attached to something?
Yes and no. It's a little bit like being in a journey with a car, you know? When you're in a journey with a car, you could be 90% of the way there. You could be just a mile away. You're still in the car, okay? And you can't get the rest of the way so easily unless you stay in the car. But then you will get out and you'll look back at the car and say, thank you, that was great. The Buddha actually gave the similar metaphor. He said that if you cross over to the other stream, let's say you come to a stream. In ancient times, there were very few bridges, for example. So you come to a stream, how do you get across? Well, you could put together sticks and branches, tie them together with vines, and make a raft. And then you can take the raft across. But when you get to the other shore, would it be skillful to put the raft up on your shoulder and keep going on dry land? The answer, of course, is no. The vehicle that took you to the other shore is for taking you to the other shore, but then being there is something else. Okay. So that's what happens with concentration. When you're developing what Patanjali and the Buddha both call dhyana, or concentration, absorption in a meditative field or object, it's accompanied by bliss, as Patanjali puts it. The Buddha uses the word exaltation or rapture, piti. The Buddha also uses the word for pleasure, but it's not sensual pleasure, such as eating an ice cream cone or listening to beautiful music. It's a different kind, a non-ordinary kind of pleasure that comes with concentration and also from being kind of cut off from the usual concerns. And that pleasure deepens, but then as concentration develops, it falls away. It's no longer necessary. But while it's happening, it's part of what's carrying you forward.
I see.
And there's energy associated with it. So these are all happening in stages.
Yes.
I'll also say that there is tremendous happiness in the practices that Patanjali and the Buddha are talking about, Because so much of our suffering is tied up in thinking that we are the painful sensation or situation that we're experiencing in this moment. We identify with it. And what these paths show is that they're not us. And the happiness is extraordinary. But it's not the kind of happiness you become addicted to.
Yeah.
It's not addictive like ice cream.
How did you know I ate ice cream today?
How did you know I ate ice cream?
But usually in today's modern yoga practice and the general knowledge about Patanjali is about the 8 limbs. It doesn't focus so much on maybe these parts that you're talking about, at least the way I got to know the sutras, was focusing always on the yamas, niyamas, asana, pranayama, and also in a very different meaning attached to asana as posture, making postures.
Yes.
So how does modern yoga practice fit in with what Patanjali was talking about as being yoga, as being a method of bringing the mind to stillness and deepening concentration?
It's such a good question. I would say that if Patanjali or the Buddha walked into a modern yoga studio and saw people practicing Iyengar yoga, say, or what's called Ashtanga yoga from the tradition of Pattabhi Jois, neither the Buddha nor Patanjali would recognize it as what they thought of as yoga. What the Buddha called yoga and advised his beggars or bhikkhus, we call them monks today, but really bhikkhu means beggars, to practice. And he said, practice this yoga. And later Patanjali is talking about a yoga that involves developing samadhi. So from outward appearances, there's very little in common with the early yoga and this more recent development. And why is that? It's because of Tantrism. And the development of Tantrism, which may have its roots very anciently, but nonetheless has really blossomed in the last 1,500 years. And it seems to have given birth, not only from the yoga side, but from the Buddhist side too, to all kinds of energy practices and theories about life, about health, about immortality, and all kinds of active practices. We call that yoga Hatha Yoga, H-A-T-H-A, Hatha. And the Hatha Yoga developed probably about 1,000 to 1,200 years ago, although perhaps earlier. It's getting pushed back all the time. When you look at the earliest Hatha Yoga, all of the poses that are given for it are in fact sitting meditation poses, just like in the early times. But as the Hatha tradition develops, it begins to include active poses that we would recognize today and see in a modern yoga studio. It also starts to involve very active processes of breathing, in which the pranayama of Patanjali, which just involves watching the breath and having it naturally fall into stillness, to the point where in the 4th level of concentration or dhyana, you can't even feel that you're breathing anymore, even though that's what you're focused on. But there's no more breathing. At least that's what it feels like. Okay? Take that, and now you have tantric pranayama, where you are actively filling the chest to the fullest, and then closing off the throat and letting your body become a vessel or a jar, which is called kumbhaka. See? And then breathing out and sealing off the throat and being a jar that holds the air out, kind of like a waterproof container, not letting the water in. So you can put your cell phone in the, when you go out on a boat. It's like that. And also techniques in which the breath is diverted from one channel of energy to the other, the pingala, through alternate nostril breathing, purifying these rivers or nadi of energy, nadi shodhana, pranayama. But for Patanjali, pranayama was just resting and observing the breath. Now here's where they actually overlap. You can't do the pranayama practices of our modern yoga or even the medieval Hatha Yoga of 300-400 years ago, where you're actively altering the breath, and Kumbhaka and Nadi Shodhana, without cultivating the same kind of awareness of the breath that Patanjali and the Buddha were teaching. You have to be present in it. You have to feel it. You can't practice it successfully from the outside. You have to give your entire attention to it. And as you do, those experiences of the outside fall away. Pratyahara. There's this process of turning toward, of concentrating. Even though it involves motion, modern yoga has to embody the same principles of mindfulness of the body. And the Buddha talked about that very thing all the time. He even had a phrase for it, mindfulness gone to the body, where you're feeling the body and its actions and efforts all the time. And that's the very first thing Patanjali says about asana or yoga sitting. He says, let go of all your effort. Now, the only way to let go of your effort is to feel it, moment to moment. Otherwise, it's automatic. And it springs from mind states and bodily states without even thinking. It's reflexive rather than free and spontaneous.
So when you teach yoga posture making, because you are teaching a regular class in Arlington Center, how do you teach it then in the context of Patanjali? Do you teach more of a state of being rather than doing the postures? And has your language changed throughout the years as how you teach yoga, your yoga language?
It's changed dramatically in the 40 years that I've been teaching. I hate to say it, but I started teaching in late 1977. So this fall, actually, this month, I've been teaching for 43 years.
Wow.
Back then, I was a student in the Iyengar and Krishnamacharya traditions. All of my teachers were oriented to the Iyengar approach, which emphasizes precision, alignment, very careful awareness of every aspect of the body, what it's doing, and how it's positioned. And even though it's often taught in a way that emphasizes doing, and thus is a kind of a menu or recitation of things to do, it cannot actually be successful unless it's cultivating a deep mindfulness of moment-to-moment bodily experiences. That was the beautiful thing about BKS Iyengar in his teachings. He himself had a very deep and precise mindfulness of his own experience, and he taught from that. Okay? But in the beginning, my language was entirely about doing yoga, getting the body to look and move a certain way, and it was only a small amount, maybe 5%, about being, about just sensing. Today, those proportions have shifted around completely. Today, 95% or even 98% of my teaching is language to bring people to awareness of what they're feeling. It's also important in physical terms because, as you might have mentioned, I have a Master's of Science degree in physical therapy and many years of clinical practice under my belt, although I'm retired from medicine. But when I was in practice and also in my training, I became aware that no two human beings are alike. That may seem obvious, but we often teach as if we were all quite similar, more similar than we are. I've dissected human cadavers as part of my training, and I can tell you that no two pairs of hip joints are the same, or shoulders, no two vertebral bodies, no two L5s of this person.
And no two soft tissues either.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Not only can they be different in shape and length, but they can also have slightly different chemical composition because of the presence of hormones and different kinds of elements that people have ingested, So a lot of it is based also on behavior, but there are strong genetic or hereditary influences to how the skeleton ends up looking. And an example that I could give you quickly is that hip joints are incredibly diverse. Some hip sockets are oriented almost forward. Others are oriented almost laterally, or all the others in between. And the top of the thigh bone, the head of the femur, can be a very steep angle or almost horizontal. It can angle forward or backward, anterior or retroverted. So the degree to which a person can abduct the legs, bring them out and apart, it can differ by 50 to 75%. Some people can spread their legs 75 degrees apart and feel stretch. Some people can bring their legs to 175 and stretch out this way. So if you teach in a cookie cutter style where everybody is the same, well, that changed my thinking about teaching yoga too a great deal. Today, my teaching uses a lot of what is called yin yoga, which is probably the modern style to the early hatha yoga. If you're not familiar with it, yin yoga
I'm very. I also
very
in yoga, but yes, and I think as a part of this festival that this recording is doing for a lot of yin yoga teachers will be. But I'd like to hear your explanation of yin yoga.
Well, for me, the discovery of yin yoga almost 20 years ago when I met Paul Grilly and encountered his work really transformed my practice at the time, because I was in my 40s then. I'm 65 now. My body was beginning to show signs of wear from the more dynamic form of yoga that I was teaching, the modern postural yoga. And what yin yoga does is it allows the deeper tissues of the body that hold the bones together, the joint capsules, the ligaments that are blended with them, the deep layers of fascia, including the periosteum over the bones, and various layers of fascia, to receive a kind of nourishing stress by resting in them, usually using gravity and position and maintaining over time. And it's this dimension of time that's most important, because what research has shown is that these connective tissues are stimulated over time, and cells within them are revived. What are called fibroblasts are revived by loading over time and begin to do the tasks that keep those soft tissues juicy and supple and also resistant to sprains. When I started practicing yin yoga, I also discovered that the prolonged stillness of it allowed the practice to be much more mindfulness-based. I was already teaching mindfulness-oriented yoga. My language had already shifted to paying attention one breath flow at a time to the experience of the body and its tiniest motions and sensations. But in the yin context of stillness for 2, 3, 4 minutes, you can really start to achieve the same kind of quiet as in sitting still in a Patanjali or Buddha posture.
Would you say interoception is a right word to use for this internal sensing of the life force without judgment, without trying to change the body? You're just sensing the body. Versus a proprioceptive, trying to put a part of the body here or there, doing. It's more of a being state to be in that interoception.
Yes, that's true, but the feeling universe includes also our exteroception, how the skin encounters the world around it, the air right now, the clothing, the seat that you're sitting on, even your hair. So the touch from outside, what feels like the world, and our skin presence is also quite significant. And both can be objects of mindfulness. But
I
you're
see.
quite right. Interoception and also the visceral field, we could call it the heart field, related to the arising of emotions. We
Yes.
experience emotions as visceral energy. And the word visceral here referring to this general area in which peoples all over the world in different cultures describe their emotions of happiness and anger arising, this general area. And there's a remarkable uniformity between different cultures in describing this. That's why in the early yoga texts, when the word citta, C-I-T-T-A, is used to describe consciousness or the mind thinking, that word also corresponds to the heart. Early peoples thought that the mind was here because this is where you feel your thoughts.
Ah.
In the Buddha's day, in fact, the brain was thought to be a receptacle of bone marrow. It wasn't recognized that it was thinking, although shortly after the Buddha's lifetime, it was recognized, and so it was added to the parts of the body to contemplate. But the brain and what it was for. How do people make the connection? Well, if your brain is injured, your cognition is impaired. You can't think, so.
But so in the yoga practice, being mindful to extroception, introception, proprioception, looking at all of these mindfully, again, where in Patanjali's 8 limbs would this fall into? I mean, would you say it's pratyahara, or would you say, no, if you're doing a movement practice, that's just separate from the seated meditation and its deepening levels of concentration?
So the feeling body resides in the asana and pranayama. Because when you sit, asana literally means sitting, as well as the seat you sit on. It also has the sense, just like in English, of not moving. For example, right now, my laptop is sitting on a support so that we can talk. So in the same sense, in Sanskrit, asana has the sense of not moving. It's very important to understand that, because when Patanjali talks about asana, where you're in the body, you come to a place where you're no longer striving to correct reality, to make it better. You're letting go of all effort. Why are we making efforts, though? Well, it's because we want this pleasant feeling to continue, or this unpleasant feeling to stop, this pleasant thought to continue, or this unpleasant thought. And if you look at yourself, you'll experience how every moment the body is subtly adjusting to the momentary feelings that are occurring. Some of them are occurring externally, so involve exteroception. Some of them are occurring proprioceptively. Most are occurring interoceptively inside the body. And we're also responding acutely to the visceral experience, the heart experience, you might say, whether we know it or not. Some of us can really know right away when our heart is heavy. But some can go on without really knowing it, but they just feel depressed or projected onto the world or the people around them. So different people have different bandwidth for that. But in asana, you're experiencing all of these dimensions of the body and letting go of effort. And you know what happens? You fall into a non-dual state. You're no longer disturbed by pleasure or pain, or wanting this or not wanting that. In fact, the feeling of me and everything else is no longer there, because the whole feeling world, exteroception and interoception, are all part of feeling. The Buddha described it a little bit differently, but points to the same thing. He called the feeling world, if you like, or the field of feeling, a sphere of knowing, along with seeing and hearing, smelling and tasting, and also mental events. And we're aware of all of those things. But it's all put together for us. We don't realize that they're being put together.
And when Patanjali talks about the 8 limbs, you mentioned that they're not necessarily sequential. They're
No.
like a Russian doll, that they're all there within each other.
That's really worth talking about. Yeah, yeah. The way that the Yoga Sutra is typically taught places yama at the beginning.
Yes.
You have to master the yama, which are ways of relating to the world, to the people and beings around you, and to material objects, possessions, things like that, in an ethical way. Interestingly, Patanjali isn't telling you you have to do it. It's not a commandment, okay? Nor is it a precept or vow. You don't, it's not like Buddhism where you take a precept and you say, for example, I undertake to refrain from harming living beings, right? Okay? In Patanjali, it's called ahimsa, or non-harming. And he simply says that if you are firmly established in non-harming, then beings around you can let go of their harming, their hostility, their aggression. All of the yamas are actually given as if-then statements rather than commandments or precepts. Now, in the way that yoga is usually taught, the tradition I first encountered, in fact, in the Iyengar Krishnamacharya parampara or lineage, then you have them saying you have to master the yama and then the niyama before you really can practice asana properly, and you have to master asana before you can practice pranayama, and so forth. Iyengar even said that in Light on Yoga, and I heard him say something like that myself, or similar. But in fact, that's not what the Yoga Sutra says at all. Think of it, again, as these Russian nested dolls, each a layer. If yama are the outside world of beings and stuff, the niyamas are the personal sphere or realm of your own practice and realization. And so what do you need to do in that sphere? You need to purify yourself, stop eating bad food, or doing things that make it hard to awaken. Also, you have to practice contentment. You have to recognize that if you want to awaken to the nature of conditions, these conditions are good enough. You don't need to go to Lululemon and get yoga pants, or travel to India, for example, to get authentic teachings. You can do it right here. You have to cultivate real energy to kind of burn with it, what's called tapas. You have to study yourself, and you have to try to see everything in the world as if you were looking through the eyes of pure awareness. Or
which is Ishvara.
Ishvara. Yes, that's exactly right. Now, what's the next sphere in from that? Asana, the body. In our personal sphere, the body, or asana, is making all these efforts. It's pulling and pushing and clenching. It expresses our tension, unhappiness, our wanting and not wanting. But letting go of all those efforts helps us to settle into a kind of steady knowing. And then the breath in the body is the next layer in. That's pranayama. Prana really means breath, but it also has the sense of aliveness. It includes all sensations. And the prana of breathing naturally ayama. It lengthens, it grows longer. That's what ayama means. It means stretching. So pranayama means as you watch the breath naturally gets slower and slower and more subtle, as the mind no longer is trying to do this or that. It's becoming concentrated. When this is happening, of course, that's when we begin to experience pratyahara, withdrawal from other sense attractions, and really begin to focus the mind, holding and becoming absorbed and in samadhi. But Patanjali says this can happen in asana. It's usually taught like a ladder. Think of it this way. The rung has to be, you have to step on this rung, and then to this rung, and then this rung, and then this rung to go up a ladder. But Patanjali is talking about dhyana, the 7th rung, in asana, the 3rd rung.
When you say asana, you're not talking about an asymmetrical, difficult posture.
No. I'm talking about a seated meditation pose, or in the modern context, even in a yin yoga pose, the mind can start to become very composed. The only problem is that modern practices, even the yin practice, you wouldn't think of holding a yin pose for more than perhaps 10 minutes. And most yin poses no more than, say, 5 minutes. Many of the yin poses I'll teach in my class this afternoon, for example, we'll hold only for 2 or 3 minutes. Whereas if I'm sitting and developing samadhi in a retreat, it might take a half hour to an hour after I've been meditating for days.
And maybe years.
and maybe even longer. Although, it's not quite as difficult as one thinks. We have really good teachers today. Yes. But it's worth noting that even people like the Buddha had a lot of problems developing concentration in the beginning. They were human beings just like us.
Yes. And I would say, and please tell me what you think, that an experience of deep concentration would then create a state of ahimsa within. So the later limbs of calming the breath and deep concentration and perhaps samadhi would then reflect back in the earlier limbs as a more effortless body with more compassion or more truth, satya, and ahimsa also developing in your life. So instead of having ahimsa, the yamas and niyamas as the first doors that you have to enter into yoga with, they could also be the result of a practice. What do you think of that?
I think it's absolutely true. And it's very helpful to understand that way. So we can practice, for example, compassion from both sides. You could say the pre and the post. What I mean by that is that we can cultivate compassion in ourselves by actively thinking about and radiating compassion for ourselves and for others. But when one begins to achieve real concentration to the point where the mind has become steady, and we begin to see how all of our personal pain and dramas, wanting and not wanting, all of the experiences tied up with I am, with identity, when you begin to see those, then compassion develops for oneself and for everybody else, because it's obvious that we're all in this same basic condition. We're all misjudging what our reality is. We really think we are our feelings. We think we are our sights and sounds, smells and tastes, our thoughts. We think that private inner world that we experience as I am, and nobody else feels this way, is the real us. But what Patanjali is telling us is that the real identity of a person is awareness. And that awareness is free. It's what's actually knowing all these events. And what feels like your awareness, for example, I'm seeing you right now on the screen. But that seeing, he says, isn't aware itself any more than the screen is aware. To Patanjali, the display of consciousness is not alive any more than a computer screen. It's too bad that these teachers didn't live today, not only because we could study with them, but also because they could use metaphors from our modern technological life to illustrate how, for example, what we take to be reality right now, what seeing is now, what hearing is right now, not only for you and me right now, but for all our viewers and listeners. What is reality? What is seeing right now? What is hearing? What is smelling and tasting? What is sensation right now? What is mentality, thoughts, and mental events and structures of all kinds? What are they? Are they actually you? Well, in fact, what you see from the platform of samadhi as you emerge from it into the final stages of opening, is the arising and the passing away of all these conditions momentarily. It's a little like frames in a movie, one after the other. We've talked about pixels in the past, and how it's pixelated, but it's not exactly like that. It's a little bit more like one after another in that sense. Although pixelation is also a way to describe momentariness. The early yogis used the word pixel in their own way. They used a word instant, or kshana, or kana in Pali, to describe the briefest possible mind moment. You see? And so you begin to experience from the deepest form of samadhi, the dharma mega, or kind of rain cloud samadhi, you begin to experience how all phenomena, whether inside you or outside in the world, are all coming and going very, very quickly. The velocity is astonishing. It feels like everything is just flowing past, and then cessation can occur, where there's a momentary dropping away of reality, and then it returns, and it's like a reboot to the computer. And the Buddha potentially called it that.
Patanjali also says that our purpose of being is to recognize this. So this is not a hobby for some people who want to see into the granular aspect of the mind. He's saying that this is why we have come to this earth, and that's a very strong statement. The Bhagavad Gita says something similar. Krishna says to Arjuna, this is why you're here, and until you align with me, you're going to keep having karma that's going to kind of knock you back into why you're actually here. I mean,
that's
wow.
Right.
So do you think in this light that it's important for yoga practitioners of today to know the sutras? I mean, otherwise we could get distracted into thinking it's all about this body's health and well-being and not achieve our human potential of this self-realization.
Yeah. Modern yoga derives in some ways from the tantric hatha yoga tradition. And that tradition is often concerned with things like not getting sick, of living to an old age, or even becoming immortal. And that can be all tied up in our yoga today, too, where we practice for health and so forth. In the Gita, though, that is exactly what Arjuna is being told. And even more profoundly in the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali is saying that it's not just about our individual lives, but in fact, in the universe, that phenomena, that the fact of phenomena, and the fact of beings having consciousness, that consciousness is there to be developed until it can show us that it is not who we really are. In other words, the purpose of matter, you might say, is to come together and to be worked with until awareness can recognize its own freedom. Because there is this awareness in reality. And no matter how you talk about it, and Patanjali and the Buddha talked about it in different ways. The Buddha actually preferred not to address it himself. But there's undoubtedly awareness in the universe. Our modern quantum science tells us that, although it doesn't yet understand how the role of that awareness and of observers seems to interact with the behavior of particles. So in that sense, you can't really say that yoga and quantum theory are closely related. But nonetheless, there does seem to be some kind of knowing. And that's the wild card, actually, in modern physics as it's developing, the leading edge of physics. They're beginning to wonder a little bit more about how consciousness really does play into the behavior of particles. It's astonishing. On the macroscopic scale, though, on the scale that we live in, that's somewhat less important. But I will say, as we talked about in an earlier conversation, that as concentration develops to the point of seeing, arising and passing away at very high speed of all reality, of all its constituent parts, one realizes that things are arriving as if in little quanta, little packets, little moments of seeing, a little moment of hearing, a little moment of feeling, but they're not sticking, they're falling away. And an image that came to my mind is that in Dharma Mega Samadhi, the rain cloud samadhi, it's like you're a big lake and perfectly smooth and reflective. And then reality is arriving, one little drop at a time, but it becomes a big rainstorm. There are thousands, even millions of raindrops, but each is arriving one by one, and then it vanishes. And so it is the experience of momentary reality in that samadhi, even though what's arriving is no different at all from what we're experiencing right now. We're just sitting here. What's different is that it's seen that it's coming one mind moment after another. And that description actually, it owes a lot to the later forms of Buddhism, of Buddhist analysis called the Abhidharma. It's very close to that too. And that's one of the ways we know that the Yoga Sutra version we have now probably originated in the late 4th century, something like that.
Both the Buddha and Patanjali talk about all of this teaching is to end suffering.
Yes.
Yes. This
but they have different theories of why suffering occurs.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask that question again, is how important do you see the Yoga Sutras in terms of today's yoga, modern yoga practitioner? Is it important for them to read and understand the Yoga Sutras as they practice? Is it important to have this map as you do any type of practice?
I think it's extremely helpful because it really gets to the heart of what our experience is and why we do what we do, including practicing yoga. You could actually go to yoga studios and practice yoga classes without ever glimpsing the possibility of it. It would be a little bit like having, let's say you were a woodworker and you had a beautiful chisel made of the finest steel, okay? But you were just using it to open soup cans instead of, shaping wood into beautiful objects. The methodology of yoga, the map that is offered by Patanjali and the Buddha, and elsewhere also, there are maps in the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita also. Those maps lead one to what it means to really be a human being and to find true happiness instead of just a kind of gratification, which whenever it's achieved is followed by its opposite, Whenever we have a deep sense pleasure, it's followed by the falling away of that and then wanting more, Yes. So, and whenever we have painful experiences also, it kind of leaves an impression on us of wanting to avoid that and tightening up our world a little bit. And these are all kind of causes of suffering, if you will. To Patanjali, though, it fundamentally comes from not recognizing that awareness is already free. So realization isn't a prison break, a jail break. It's not getting out of some prison. For him, freedom is recognizing that awareness is free right now. And if that's what this is teaching, that's of enormous value to every human being, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. We've been talking for an hour now, and I think we've finished our time. But we could talk 10 more hours. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and your wisdom, Chip. And I hope to meet you in person one day. Either you can come to Turkey or Oxford, or I'll come to America. But
I'd like to come to you. I'd like to come to Oxford and
escape America right now.
Yeah, I'd be happy to leave America right now, although they won't let me out. They won't let us out. But may that all change. May all beings be happy and free.
Yes, thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Zina.
much for your time. Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
So David, did it record? Yes, inshallah. Inshallah. Thank you.
Inshallah. Oh,
I
thank
I
you.
think it was nice. I think we
Yeah.
got to the points that are more well, people will be interested in quicker.
Yeah,
Because
much better.
before
Much
we went
better.
into the Buddhist, it was a lot of the Buddhist psychology and those terms, which I think were difficult for me, and I'm guessing would be difficult for the regular Turkish person
Definitely.
anyway.
I thought it went much better than the first
Good.
conversation on my end because, again, I tried to keep it more down to earth. Although I still have a hard time doing that. I still have a lot to learn, but it's really good practice talking to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have one more question personally. David and I were talking about this before. Did you come into the yoga from a sense of suffering in your childhood, or did it come just you were drawn to the teachings without undergoing a lot of suffering?
This is the trailer.
This is great. I see that we're not recording anymore.
No, we're
not
not.
recording. You sly dog, you. Okay, so.
Do you want me to stop the recording?
No, not at all. I like to make jokes, but I'm fine with it. In fact, I had a happy childhood, but I did experience some forms of suffering or trauma as a young person. My parents divorced. There was real acrimony and bitterness between them. It was a very kind of painful period. But I consider myself very fortunate. I think anyone who happens to discover the Dharma, who's introduced to it, is a really fortunate person. The Buddha said that, and he's right. And Patanjali hints at that also. We're really lucky to have, encountered that. The Buddha himself, as you know in the famous story, seemed to have, I'm talking about Gautama now, Siddhartha Gautama, he seemed to have a hole in his heart. He was interested in exploring what suffering is. I wonder if it was from being a motherless child, because his mother, Mahamaya, died within a few days of his birth in Lumbini, a place where I've been, by the way, Lumbini in Nepal, near Indian border. And so he was interested in suffering and in pain. And that was also a big concern of the early strivers or shramanas, all the ascetics. They were trying to deal with pain. They figured, well, if my life is being ruled by hunger and the need for clothing and sleep and shelter, then I'm going to go forth into the world. I'm going to take my clothes off. I'm not going to have to eat very much, if anything, anymore. And I'm even going to hold positions for long periods of time without moving. And when I feel pain, I'm going to confront it and conquer it right there. And that impulse to do that, which is no greater anywhere than in the Jains or the Jinas, it's very powerful. And it does, as we were talking about before, it does bring one to very strong states of concentration. And it can even produce these extraordinary powers in some people, but it doesn't lead to the end of suffering, which is why eventually Gautama, rejected it and let go of it. And it's why Patanjali doesn't teach that path either.
The path of making yourself suffer in order to awaken.
Yes. For Gautama, in fact, he almost starved to death. He was so emaciated that he probably looked like somebody coming out of the Civil War prison in the 150 years ago, or coming out of Auschwitz or concentration camp. He said you could see the front of his spine in his belly.
Oof.
So that's seriously emaciated. He said his skin had turned dark. He was quite fair. And, his hair, all his hair fell out all over his body. He was very sick. In fact, if he hadn't started eating, he would have died, if his account is true. And he didn't like to talk about himself. There are only a few little fragments where he actually talks about his early life. But they're quite different than the legend of the Buddha, Yeah. They just show an ordinary person like you,
Yeah.
like me,
Yeah, and
suffering
I think
and
that's a teacher who can convey that sense of relationship with the Buddha, like almost like a friend, someone that they know, someone that they're intimate with. I think that's a big change, a big quality, like to have that sense of that this is not some mystical or some other world being, but this is a human and someone who has the same aches and pains as we do.
oh yes, oh yes. The problem is that the Buddhist traditions have gone largely in the opposite direction,
Yeah.
as all religions do. Within a very short time after the Buddha's death, he was already being converted into a kind of deity.
Yeah.
You know, in the Mahayana Buddhist scheme, you start to see these kind of extraterrestrial Buddhist bodies, if you will. And that's true, of course, in the case of Jesus of Nazareth also. And perhaps, I don't know your views about this, but I've always thought that Muhammad also probably, how people saw him became enhanced, and kind of lifted up from being just a human being. I personally believe that Muhammad and Jesus, Yesu, and Gautama and others like that were human beings, and that they were teaching something important about being human. So making them divine actually harms the teaching in a way. It makes it very difficult. The Buddha, for example, really, you could think of him as a friend, as a Kalyanamitta. Do you know that expression, Kalyanamitta?
Yeah.
A spiritual friend?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a very beautiful idea.
Yeah, and I think that's when you actually start to discover, you don't rarefy the Buddha, you start to discover and you develop a relationship, a friendship, and that's when it's more potent.
Yes.
Is my sense.
Yes. I think so, because with our friends, we can admire our friends, but we recognize that they are human beings. And the Buddha made lots of mistakes. He did some really stupid things, and he's the first to admit it. He's just a human being, and he had a human life. In fact, he says in one of those very few autobiographical excerpts, he says, "When I left home, my parents were against it, and they wept as I went away."
Yeah.
Not that legend of him sneaking off in the middle of the night. No, he said, I'm leaving, and they were weeping. Who hasn't had an experience? I had the same experience myself, in fact. Maybe you did. And then, of course, going through this whole period that lasted perhaps 5 years or more, where he was engaging in very severe austerities and almost died. Again, not so smart.
Yeah.
No.
Anyway, I feel we should let you go.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you guys also talked.
Yeah,
I am too. It's such a pleasure to meet you. And of course, Zeynep, we've been writing a little bit, but a real pleasure to meet you. I didn't tell you a story, by the way, when we were talking, but when I first read the Yoga Sutra, I fell asleep at the part in the beginning where he talks about sleep as being one of the 5 forms of consciousness, 5 chittavritti, right? And so he gets to sleep, and I would fall asleep, and the book would fall to the side of the bed. I have a little pile of different versions of the Yoga Sutra next to my bed where I'd fallen asleep and they'd fallen there, and then I never picked them up. I just bought a different version. I joke about it, I kid about it, but it's really true. And when my book came out, my daughter was in high school and suffering from insomnia. And she said to me one time, the book was just out and it was on the kitchen table. And she said, "Daddy, I just didn't sleep last night. I really had trouble getting to sleep." I just pushed the book over to her and said, "Read that before you go to bed." No problem. And the next morning I said, "How did you sleep?" And she said, "Oh, I had a great sleep. Thank you." Yeah.
Well, apparently on all of the meditation apps and everything, the most popular stream is sleep meditation. So There you go. Just put your book on. Just read it.
I'll just read my book. That's what my girlfriend always says. She says, I'm having trouble sleeping. Could you tell me about Buddhism? Yeah. Must be a wonderful teacher to be able to do that. Good. All right, everybody.
Okay. Take care.
Thanks, yeah, take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.